Snow lay undisturbed along the service road when a flashlight beam caught fabric where none belonged, half buried by wind, stiff with cold, anonymous in darkness, waiting for hands that would log, bag, and measure, treating it as evidence rather than memory on a December morning. That refused any warmth. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Nevada in December carries a particular quiet, the kind that settles over desert towns when holiday lights flicker against long nights and the highways thin. In 2005, the community outside Reno felt that quiet break when a missing person flyer hardened into a recovery notice. The victim was 23 years old, a recent graduate balancing seasonal work and the promise of a new year. She lived alone in a modest apartment near a frontage road, the sort of place where mailboxes rattle in winter wind and neighbors know one another by vehicles more than names. Thanksgiving had passed without incident. Christmas was approaching. New Year plans were penciled, not inked. The discovery site sat beyond the last streetlight, near an irrigation culvert that collected runoff from winter storms. Patrol officers secured the perimeter and logged the time, temperature, and weather. A forensic team photographed impressions before the sun could soften them. The body was positioned in a way that suggested concealment rather than display, consistent with hurried placement and an effort to avoid detection by passing traffic. There was no sign of struggle at the scene. The absence itself became a fact to be preserved. The autopsy would later establish the manner of death without spectacle. Time of death was estimated within a narrow window based on core temperature, lividity, and environmental exposure. There were no defensive injuries noted. Toxicology was ordered as routine. The pathologist documented fibers, soil, and trace material, sealing samples that would sit for years in cold storage. Every step followed protocol because protocol is what endures when memory fades. Investigators reconstructed the victim's last known movements using receipts, cell phone pings, and interviews conducted while recollections were still fresh. She had been seen at a grocery store buying holiday staples. She spoke briefly with a coworker about extra shifts. Her phone showed a final outgoing call early in the evening. There were no alarming messages, no threats, no dramatic exit. The ordinariness complicated everything. Local media covered the case with restraint typical of the region. Headlines emphasized timelines and appeals for information rather than speculation. The sheriff's office held a brief press conference to correct rumors and to request help from drivers who used the service road after dark. Tips came in uneven waves, swelling after Christmas, thinning by mid-January. Most were well-intentioned and unhelpful. A few required quiet elimination. The apartment was processed methodically. Nothing was broken. The refrigerator held food for the coming week. A small artificial tree stood unlit. Laundry lay folded. Investigators logged footwear impressions and vacuumed for trace. The front door showed no forced entry. Windows were locked. The conclusion at that stage was simple and unsettling. She likely left willingly, at least initially. Records checks followed. No recent restraining orders. No active disputes. Financial accounts showed no unusual withdrawals. A background review of acquaintances produced names that would be interviewed and re-interviewed. Each interview was documented, cross-referenced, and filed. Alibis were noted with times and corroboration. In December, alibis are often strong, anchored by family gatherings and seasonal routines, yet they still required verification. The case cooled as winter advanced. Snowstorms buried the culvert. Evidence went to lockers and shelves labeled with dates. Detectives rotated to other priorities, but the file remained active. On anniversaries, a brief article would appear, reminding readers of the unresolved loss. The victim's age froze in print, while the town aged around it. Years later, advances in forensic analysis and a renewed review of cold cases brought the file back to a conference table. The department had digitized old reports, allowing patterns to surface. A fiber once considered inconclusive now matched a manufacturing batch. Soil composition from the culvert aligned with a specific construction site active in 2005. A cell tower map, once coarse, could now be refined. Investigators revisited witnesses with care, aware of time's distortions. Some memories sharpened, others softened. One routine traffic stop from that December resurfaced in records, noting a vehicle parked near the service road at an unusual hour. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it earned a second look. The suspect pool narrowed without drama. It did so through elimination, documentation, and patience. A former acquaintance's statements shifted subtly across interviews, not in content but in emphasis. Employment records contradicted an asserted schedule. Phone data placed a device near the culvert during the critical window. Each fact alone was insufficient. Together, they formed a line. Search warrants were obtained. Property was examined with modern tools. Trace evidence long stored found context. The chain of custody held. Prosecutors reviewed the case before charges were contemplated, ensuring that what remained could withstand scrutiny. This was not a rush to judgment. It was the slow turning of a key that had always been there. By the time an arrest was made, the town responded quietly. There were no crowds, no sirens for spectacle. A name appeared in the local paper beside a booking photograph. The charge reflected the evidence, not the anger. In court, the timeline was laid out with winter dates and ordinary places. The verdict would come later, but the path to it was visible. For the family, closure arrived without celebration. Christmas lights still went up. New Year's still came. The service road remained unremarkable again. In the archive, a file moved from unresolved to resolved. A single line changed. For those who worked it, that line mattered. It meant the procedures had held through cold, through years, through silence. The geography mattered in ways that were easy to overlook. Northern Nevada is a place of distances, where a short drive can feel longer at night and winter weather changes quickly. The service road linked industrial parcels to arterial routes used by shift workers. Traffic cameras were sparse in 2005, and private security footage was rare. Investigators mapped probable routes based on fuel receipts and average travel times, a slow arithmetic built from paper logs and patience. The victim's social circle reflected the season. Holiday gatherings compressed weeks of interaction into nights, and guest lists overlapped. Investigators compared names across Thanksgiving dinners, office parties, and informal get-togethers, noting who appeared repeatedly and who did not. Each name generated a file. Each file generated questions. Answers were tested against time cards, toll records, and weather reports that documented when snow fell and when plows passed. The medical examiner's findings guided direction without theatrics. Cause and manner were recorded with careful language. The absence of certain injuries suggested a narrow range of scenarios. The presence of trace materials suggested transfer. None of it proved identity. All of it narrowed possibility. Samples were cataloged with the expectation that future techniques would find what contemporary tools could not. Community response stayed measured. There were vigils, but they were small and brief, fitting the local character. Donations went toward a reward fund that grew modestly and then stagnated. Flyers faded on bulletin boards. The sheriff's office maintained a tip line and logged calls long after the news cycle moved on. Every December, a reporter would call for an update and receive the same answer, that the case remained open. Internally, the file accumulated marginalia. Handwritten notes marked inconsistencies. Maps were redrawn. A timeline was revised as new data corrected old assumptions. Investigators learned to distrust convenience. A plausible story that fit the calendar was still tested against objective records. When it failed, it was discarded without commentary. Training changed over the years. Detectives who had worked the case retired. New investigators learned it as an exercise in procedure. The lessons were practical: preserve everything, document decisions, assume technology will improve, assume memory will not. Those lessons kept the case alive without noise. By the early 2010s, the department joined a regional cold case task force. Shared databases allowed cross-jurisdictional comparison. Similar cases were reviewed for patterns in victim profile, location, and season. Nothing conclusive emerged, but the process refined focus. It reduced the field to those with access, opportunity, and unverified movement during the narrow winter window. The file returned to the culvert more than once. Soil samples were compared as standards improved. The conclusion held. The site was a deposit point, not the origin. That distinction mattered. It suggested planning measured in minutes, not hours, and a familiarity with the road that exceeded casual use. All of this work set the stage for what would follow. When a new lead finally emerged, it did so because the foundation was solid. There were no leaps, only steps taken long ago that had been waiting for the ground to catch up. The renewed review began with paper. Boxes were pulled from climate-controlled storage and laid out across a long table, the smell of old cardboard and toner filling the room. Reports from 2005 were reread without nostalgia. Investigators treated each paragraph as if it were new, noting what had been assumed rather than proven. December dates were highlighted. Weather logs were stapled to patrol notes. The method was deliberate, almost clinical, because sentiment had no value here. Cell phone records, once little more than call lists, were reprocessed through updated mapping software. The victim's final outgoing call aligned with a tower sector that covered the grocery store and a short stretch of road leading toward her apartment. An incoming call minutes later had once been dismissed as a pocket dial. Now it was examined in context. The originating device belonged to an acquaintance whose name appeared several times in the file, always adjacent to plausible explanations, always just beyond proof. Employment records were subpoenaed again. Time cards from a warehouse on the outskirts of town showed a shift ending earlier than previously stated. Payroll data confirmed the adjustment. Surveillance at the facility was long gone, but gate logs remained, handwritten and imperfect. A vehicle matching the acquaintance's truck was recorded exiting near the time in question. It was not definitive. It was consistent. The service road traffic stop resurfaced because of a retired officer's margin note. He had written that the driver seemed unfamiliar with the area. That detail had meant nothing in 2005. Now it was compared against the acquaintance's address history, which showed a recent move from another county. The truck's registration had lapsed weeks later, renewed quietly without comment. Small things, when aligned, begin to speak. Investigators requested permission to examine the truck, now owned by a relative. Consent was granted. Forensic technicians worked with restraint, aware of the years between contact and collection. Upholstery yielded fibers that matched those cataloged at autopsy, not by appearance alone but by polymer composition and dye. The match was not singular. It was sufficient to justify the next step. Prosecutors were consulted early. They insisted on corroboration beyond trace. Financial records showed a purchase of cleaning supplies the morning after the disappearance, paid in cash. Store cameras were gone, but receipts were archived. Weather records indicated snow overnight, complicating timelines, but also limiting alternative explanations for certain tracks photographed near the culvert. A reconstruction placed the truck in proximity during the critical window. Witness interviews resumed with care. The acquaintances' statements were compared line by line across years. The facts did not change, but the order did. Times shifted by minutes. Destinations were described with less certainty. None of this proved guilt. It did establish unreliability. Investigators documented the differences without accusation. The apartment was revisited in theory. No forced entry suggested familiarity. Keys were accounted for, but a spare was missing, a detail buried in an early report. The acquaintance had once helped with a move, a fact confirmed by neighbors who remembered the truck. The memory surfaced only when prompted by photographs from 2005, a reminder that recall can be guided without being manufactured. Laboratory advancements provided another hinge. Touch DNA, inconclusive in the past, yielded a partial profile from an item recovered near the body. The profile could not identify on its own, but it excluded several early persons of interest. It did not exclude the acquaintance. That mattered. A search warrant followed, narrowly tailored and reviewed twice. Digital storage devices were seized. Deleted files were recovered. Nothing sensational emerged. What did emerge was a calendar entry, mundane, noting a meeting that did not occur and a route that made no sense unless one knew the service road. The entry predated the disappearance. It suggested familiarity. When the arrest came, it came quietly, on a cold morning that mirrored the one described in the file's opening pages. The charge reflected the evidence assembled, not speculation. Bail was denied based on flight risk and the weight of corroboration. The community read the notice over coffee and said little. The pretrial phase tested the work. Defense motions challenged the age of evidence and the reliability of memory. The court weighed chain of custody and documentation. The record held. Each item had been logged, stored, and transferred according to policy. Each decision had been justified at the time it was made. At trial, the prosecution avoided theatrics. The timeline was presented as a sequence of ordinary actions against a backdrop of winter routines. The defense argued coincidence. The jury listened to experts explain fibers and phone data in plain language. The weather reports were read aloud, grounding abstract minutes in real snowfall. The verdict arrived after careful deliberation. It was guilty. The sentence followed statutory guidelines, neither maximal nor symbolic. In the courtroom, there was no applause. Outside, snow fell lightly, the kind that erases footprints by morning. In the aftermath, records were updated. The cold case unit closed the file with a summary that emphasized process over outcome. The victim's name was added to a memorial that listed dates rather than details. For investigators, the lesson was reaffirmed. Time does not defeat evidence if evidence is respected. The town returned to its rhythms. December lights went up. Service roads carried trucks to warehouses. The culvert collected runoff and nothing more. In the archive, a box was moved to a different shelf, its label amended. That change did not bring warmth, but it brought truth, and in winter, that was enough. The conviction did not end the work. It redirected it. Administrative reviews followed, not to revisit guilt, but to document how a case moved from winter silence to lawful resolution. Training officers summarized the file for younger investigators, emphasizing what had mattered and what had not. The emphasis stayed on patience, on resisting narrative gravity, on allowing facts to accumulate without forcing them to cohere too soon. Evidence retention policies were cited with approval. Items sealed in 2005 were still intact, their labels legible, their logs complete. The department's decision years earlier to invest in climate-controlled storage had paid dividends no one could have predicted at the time. The lesson carried weight in budget meetings that winter, when funding requests compete with immediate needs. Cold cases argue quietly for long horizons. Media attention returned briefly and then faded. Coverage focused on the process rather than the person, consistent with the community's tone. There were no televised reenactments, no late-night speculation. The local paper printed a timeline and an editorial on diligence. Letters to the editor were few and restrained. This was not a place that celebrated resolution as spectacle. For the victim's family, the legal outcome settled into daily life slowly. Holidays remained difficult, but they were no longer marked by unanswered questions. They declined interviews and issued a short statement thanking investigators. The statement acknowledged the years without closure and the work that had continued without headlines. It asked for privacy. The request was respected. The offender entered the correction system and began serving a sentence measured in decades. Appeals were filed and denied in due course. Each ruling cited the same foundations: corroborated evidence, preserved chain of custody, expert testimony grounded in accepted methods. The case became a citation in appellate opinions on the admissibility of aged forensic material. That, too, mattered. The service road was repaved the following summer. Construction crews worked around the culvert, improving drainage. There was no marker. There did not need to be one. Investigators drove past occasionally, not out of ritual but because work takes people where it takes them. The road was just a road again. Within the department, the cold case unit refined its intake criteria. The Nevada file was used to justify reopening others from the early 2000s. Investigators requested updated lab testing where it made sense and declined where it did not. The discipline was to avoid phishing. Each request required a rationale tied to new capability or new information. Community trust showed itself in small ways. Tips came in for other cases. People called when they remembered something ordinary that might matter. The department logged and followed up. Not every call led anywhere. The point was that people believed their information would be handled properly, not consumed for effect. Weather records continued to be used as anchors. Investigators taught recruits to read them not as background but as evidence. Snowfall times narrow windows. Temperature shifts affect decomposition and movement. Plow schedules create inadvertent witnesses. In winter states, weather is a participant, not a setting. The case file included a final section labeled Aftermath. It listed procedural changes, training updates, and recommendations. It did not include commentary. That restraint reflected the ethos of the unit. Closure was not a story beat. It was an administrative state. Years later, when a similar case emerged in another county, the Nevada file was requested through interagency channels. Investigators compared notes on service roads, on seasonal routines, on the way December compresses time and expands alibis. The comparison did not imply similarity of offenders. It reinforced similarity of methods. The courthouse where the trial had concluded returned to routine. Files were archived. Clerks processed new cases. The docket moved. The building's limestone held the cold in winter and the heat in summer, indifferent to outcomes. Justice, in this sense, was procedural rather than emotional. Local landmarks continued their cycles. A diner near the highway reopened after renovations. A hardware store expanded its winter inventory. The grocery store where the victim had last been seen installed new cameras, not because of the case but because technology advanced. Still, investigators noted it with a quiet nod to prevention. The department marked the anniversary of the resolution internally. There was no ceremony. A memo circulated thanking those who had contributed across years. Names included retirees and technicians whose work had never been public. The memo emphasized teamwork and continuity. It ended without flourish. In training rooms, instructors reminded recruits that cold cases are not solved by brilliance alone. They are solved by record keeping, by skepticism, by waiting for tools to catch up with care. The Nevada case illustrated that principle cleanly. No single piece of evidence had carried the day. The day arrived because the pieces were kept. The victim's age remained 23 in the records. That number never changes. What changed was the status line beneath it, from unresolved to resolved, from open to closed. Those words are blunt. They are not consolation. They are accurate. December returned each year with its lights and quiet. Investigators noticed the pattern because they had learned to notice patterns. They noticed how calls drop during holidays and surge after. They noticed how memory sharpens when routines break. They noticed how winter both hides and reveals. In the end, the case did not redefine the town. It affirmed it. A place that values procedure over spectacle, patience over noise, and records over rumors. The road, the culvert, the courthouse, the archive. These were the witnesses that remained when people moved on. The final report closed with a summary of facts and a statement of outcome. It did not speculate on motive beyond what evidence supported. It did not moralize. It documented. That documentation is what endures, long after Christmas decorations come down and New Year calendars turn. For those who listened to the story later, the tension did not come from violence. It came from waiting, from winter nights and unanswered calls, from files that sat until they did not, from the knowledge that ordinary places can hold extraordinary weight until care releases it. The Nevada case joined the quiet ledger of solved cold cases. It did so without altering the weather or the roads. It altered a line in a book and a burden carried by a family. In the measured language of the law, that was enough. Years after the sentence was imposed, the Nevada case continued to surface quietly in professional settings. It was referenced in training binders and discussed in low voices among detectives who understood what it meant to carry a file across seasons. The emphasis was never on the offender's name. It was on how easily a case can slip into dormancy if procedure falters, and how patiently it can return if procedure holds. The cold case unit documented the timeline one final time, compressing thousands of pages into a clear narrative that could be audited without interpretation. Each action was dated. Each decision was sourced. Where assumptions had once existed, the report noted how they were later corrected. This transparency was intentional. It acknowledged that early investigators worked with limits that no longer existed, and that progress came from continuity rather than correction. The laboratory report addenda were appended last. They detailed how advancements in fiber analysis and DNA recovery had refined earlier conclusions without contradicting them. The language was cautious. The science had improved, but it had not rewritten the past. It had clarified it. That distinction mattered for credibility, especially in a case measured across decades. The legal record closed with the appellate court's final denial. The ruling was brief and methodical. It cited precedent, affirmed admissibility, and deferred to the jury's role as fact finder. There was no commentary on emotion or impact. The law does not linger where it does not need to. It moves on, carrying its own weight. For the victim's family, time altered the meaning of the resolution. In the early months, relief existed alongside exhaustion. Later, the resolution became a fixed point, a date that replaced uncertainty. Holidays remained complicated, but they were no longer interrupted by hope that tomorrow might bring news. The absence of waiting became its own kind of peace. The apartment complex where the victim had lived changed hands. Paint colors shifted. Mailboxes were replaced. Tenants came and went, unaware of the history. That anonymity was appropriate. Places outlive events, and communities do not require markers to remember what procedure already preserves. Local law enforcement adopted several internal reforms influenced by the case. Evidence intake forms were revised to emphasize future testing potential. Interview summaries were standardized to reduce interpretive language. Digital archiving protocols were expanded to include metadata that had once been discarded as trivial. None of these changes were dramatic. They were cumulative. The service road continued to function as infrastructure, not symbol. Trucks used it at night. Snow collected in drifts and melted in daylight. Investigators avoided assigning meaning where none remained. The road had been relevant because of circumstance, not destiny. That clarity prevented myth-making. In academic circles, the case was cited in discussions about cold case solvability in regions with seasonal extremes. Analysts noted how winter weather both obscured and preserved evidence, delaying discovery while maintaining integrity. The Nevada example demonstrated how environmental factors must be treated as variables, not obstacles. The offender aged within the system, becoming another number in a managed population. Reports noted compliance, work assignments, routine medical care. There were no incidents tied to notoriety. The case did not follow him through the institution as a story. It followed as a file, summarized in intake paperwork and rarely revisited. For investigators who had retired, the resolution arrived as confirmation rather than surprise. They had trusted the record. They had trusted that careful work does not expire. Some attended the internal briefing when the case was formally closed, sitting quietly at the back of the room. There were nods, nothing more. The public memory of the case thinned naturally. New stories replaced old ones. Younger residents knew nothing of the winter when flyers hung in grocery store windows. That forgetting was not failure. It was function. Justice does not require perpetual attention to remain valid. The archive retained the physical file, even after digitization. Boxes were labeled and stored according to policy. Retention schedules were updated to ensure availability for future review, however unlikely. The decision reflected institutional humility. No system assumes it has learned everything. Each December, when annual reports were compiled, the case appeared as a statistic, one line among many. Solved. The word carried no adjectives. It did not reference shock or closure. It simply indicated status. In law enforcement accounting, that simplicity is deliberate. The case influenced how investigators approached seasonal disappearances. They learned to account for holiday routines that compress opportunity and mask deviation. They learned that Thanksgiving and Christmas alter witness availability and memory. These lessons extended beyond Nevada, shared through conferences and informal networks. The courthouse clerk who had processed the original missing person filing retired years later. In an exit interview, she mentioned the case only once, noting how unusual it was to see a file return after so long and conclude properly. Her comment was noted in a personnel memo and then forgotten, like many accurate observations. In the broader context, the case reaffirmed a principle often stated but rarely proven cleanly. Justice delayed does not have to be justice denied, provided delay is accompanied by care. Evidence does not age on its own. It ages according to how it is treated. The final internal communication regarding the case was a brief email. It thanked contributors, confirmed archival actions, and closed the project code. There were no attachments. Everything that needed to be said had already been written. For listeners encountering the story later, the tension resided not in what happened, but in how long it took to know. It resided in winter calendars and unanswered phones, in reports reread under different light. It resided in the discipline of waiting without abandoning responsibility. The Nevada town continued its cycles, roads iced and cleared. Holiday lights came down. New Year calendars replaced old ones. The systems that resolved the case remained in place, quiet and functional. That continuity was the real outcome. When investigators speak about the case now, they do so briefly. They mention December. They mention a service road. They mention storage and patience. They do not dramatize. The story does not require it. The final measure of the case was not the arrest, nor the sentence, nor the headlines. It was the integrity of the process from start to finish. That integrity held through weather, time, and change. In the end, the file rests where it should, closed but accessible, complete but unadorned. The victim's name is recorded accurately. The facts are preserved. The law has spoken. The quiet that follows is not absence. It is resolution.